Hi. Now, the biggest benefit to using n8n is that you get to create a well-defined workflow that an entire team can plug into. That means that whether they know it or not, when they are performing a particular task, they're using that optimized process. In this guide, what I'll show you is a way that you can go from an MCP, Model Context Protocol, running within your Claude Code, and then turn that into an optimized process that you can then roll out to your entire team. So now what all this means is that you get to use fewer tokens and you get to use smaller models, so much more sustainable, and you get to deliver more consistent and reliable results every single time. And what it also does is it reduces your risk, so no accidental pushes of experiments or no accidental deletions of experiments. Now, this isn't going to be a step-by-step play in terms of building a workflow. Instead, my intention is to show you the techniques and processes to build an n8n workflow like the one I gave away in my last video. What that workflow did was that it generated some JavaScript for an A/B test and then pushed that JavaScript into the testing tool, i.e. Convert. Let's get to it and I'll show you how I went about building that workflow. Quick recap of MCPs. MCPs are great, but they come with an element of risk. They're powerful, and that's precisely the problem. When you give an AI MCP access, you're essentially handing it over the tools to cause havoc and then trusting that it won't. That doesn't seem like a great idea to me. At the same time, MCPs solve a major problem, in my opinion, with APIs, in that they can be a little bit cumbersome to work with. And this is where MCPO comes in. MCPO converts MCPs back into an API, but a well-documented API service, and gives you some clean, structured endpoints to work with. And because everything is now exposed as API endpoints, you get the best of both worlds. We get to use the ease of MCPs, but we get to use the specificity and the control that you get from using APIs. I'm not going to show you how to go about installing MCPO. Their documentation does do a pretty good job at this. I also want to point out that this guide is going to be slightly more technical than usual guides, so it requires a little bit more technical knowledge. Not much, but a little bit more technical knowledge. With that said, here is a Docker Compose file for my MCPO. Key things here is the config.json, which is here, which is this MCP client where you set up your MCP servers. So here I've set up the convert API key, put in your API key there, convert secret and secret in there, and then it's just exposing all of the tools. So that's where you put in the config.json is where I put in all of the MCP servers. Then the other thing is that I always like to set up an API key, and then you just create a secure API key. It could be anything really, or it could be password. And then we'll be using that to get access to the MCPO service. So without this, access is denied, basically. And then once you started the service, you'll get a web page, and then you'll get this really nice Swagger UI for your MCP service. So this is the API endpoints. And then just authorize that with your API key. And then you'll see down here, you can just go about trying out sending posts, executing posts to your API endpoints, which we'll be getting into later on. A quick reminder, this is a workflow that we're building. And if we pay attention to just these parts, what this does is it's a submission form where users need to put in the URL and the description of the change. And once it's submitted, it uses the URL to fetch the HTML for the page. And then with that HTML for the page, it creates a JavaScript, names the experiment, and then sets the variables. So simple enough. The second part of the workflow is what I want to focus on. So this is where we have an API call to create the experience. And then once we get the response, we get the IDs, and then we create the variation from there. So how did I figure out the JSON for this? What I did was I headed over to Claude Code and I said, use the Convert MCP tool to create a simple experiment called boot test on my site, experimentation.com, with JavaScript. And this is just some placeholder JavaScript. You can get it to generate the JavaScript as well if you want, but it's just going to waste more tokens that way. And then after that, you'll just go away and do its thing. And then you can either find the API calls within here, or simply ask it to give you the API calls nicely formatted, as I've done here. So these are the two steps that is taken. Step 1, create the experience. Step 2, create the variation. And then I can just copy that JSON and then head on over to the Swagger UI. This is for the MCPO tool. Don't forget to authorize this with your API key. And then down in experiences, I can just use tryout and paste the JSON in and then execute. And then this is the response, so sent back. So this was successful. And if I go over to my Convert account, I can see the A/B test was set up correctly. Now I know for a fact that this is probably sending it a little bit too much information. So I could then go about like hacking away parts of this just to make sure it still works and get the minimal requests that I need to create my experiment. But this works. And then once you've got a JSON that works, head on over to n8n and you have all the information you need from the Swagger. Head back to Swagger. And I usually like to look here, but you can also look here. So this is the request URL, and it was a post that it was sending. So post, the request URL, JSON body, the JSON, and then put the JSON in. And just mind that you fill in the information with the actual variables being passed through in your workflow rather than hard-coded variables. And that's it. So that's my create experience node done. And then for the next step, I know based on the response, I'm going to get somewhere along here the experience and variation ID. So here we go, variation ID. So I'm going to get the experience and the variation ID in the response. And looking at my Claude Code JSON, I needed that information to make the next call, which was to create the variation. So to create the variation, I needed an experience ID and a variation ID. So this is what all this AI does. It just takes that response data and then it just extracts the key IDs. Now, I used AI for this. You could just write some code to fetch this as well. Now, this process may not be a one-size-fits-all approach for all of the MCP tools, but it's going to be similar. So you're going to be using Claude Code or something like that, and then going to be using the output from that, the steps that it takes, to inform what you put into your API calls. The whole point of this is to show you a workflow, to build a workflow within n8n that is secure and very efficient at that. But anyway, thanks for following along, and hope to see you next time.